Introduction. A silent shadow turns into a monster. Imagine a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of community where lawns are neatly mowed, porch lights flicker at dusk, and families gather for backyard barbecues. Life moves on in predictable rhythms of safety and routine. Now picture the unimaginable lurking behind this peaceful facade, a seemingly ordinary individual blending into the crowd but harboring a dark and deeply twisted hatred. This isn't your typical monster, no gruesome scars, hulking frame, or sinister glint in their eyes. It's someone who might have held the door open for you at the grocery store, someone small in stature, unassuming, even forgettable. And yet, hidden under this guise is a storm of fury and pain, one that would soon erupt into a reign of terror stretching across multiple American states. Over just a few short months, this phantom of death unleashed horror like the nation had rarely seen. His weapon, rage, his targets, innocents chosen seemingly at random, victims whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was no ordinary killer. He didn't just take lives. He desecrated, humiliated, sent messages, written in blood, on walls, leaving behind chilling trademarks of his profound disdain for society. His actions weren't about spur-of-the-moment anger or desperation. No, his crimes seemed methodically unhinged, calculated to strike both fear and hopelessness into the hearts of every community he touched. This silent shadow, as the media grew fond of calling him, first appeared in the bustling heart of New York City. The Big Apple, known for its resilience, its invincibility, was about to have that illusion shattered. When crime scene tape was strung around a rundown apartment complex in Brooklyn, few predicted the nature of what lay inside. Even the most hardened investigators would later admit to sleepless nights after witnessing the sheer brutality left in the wake of this monster. From there, the nightmare spread across the country, snaking its way southward to rural Texas, and later touching the coastal highways of California. He seemed to move like a ghost, leaving fear and carnage wherever he tread. What made this all the more astounding was his cover, a small man, shorter than many of his victims with no criminal record to his name and a past marked by hardship rather than infamy. Initial sketches portrayed him as diminutive, with wiry features, hardly the image you'd conjure when imagining someone capable of such atrocities. Neighbors, former co-workers, those who crossed paths with him, struggled to reconcile the friendly face they knew with the monster on their television screens. "He never struck me as violent," one acquaintance claimed. "A little withdrawn maybe, not really noticeable, but evil? No way." Yet evil has a way of hiding in the mundane, wearing the mask of the familiar until it catches you completely off guard. This was America's boogeyman, not lurking in the shadows of dark alleys or abandoned factories, but grinning past you at a coffee shop, standing behind you in line at the DMV. And as the body count rose and the national panic spiked, one question hovered over every American household. How does someone so ordinary turn into something so unspeakably terrible? Some stories are whispered over campfires to scare children into behaving, leaving the adult world unshaken. But not this one. This is the kind of story that seeps into your subconscious and lingers as you double-check your locks before bed. A story that crawls under the blanket of safety and order we so desperately cling to in modern life. This is not about the usual caricatures of evil. It's a tale of a monster who could be anyone, or worse, no one you'd expect. Brace yourself for a journey through shattered innocence and suburbia's downfall, where the lines between the ordinary and the unimaginable blur. As the trail of blood grows, the question isn't just who is he, but what turned him into America's devil? In exploring this chilling narrative, we'll delve into the mind of a killer, the societal cracks he slipped through, and the relentless hunt that brought his reign of terror to an end. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about evil, about survival, and about the hidden struggles that can fester in silence until they explode. The first case, blood on the streets of New York. New York City, the city that never sleeps, is as much a haven for dreamers as it is a magnet for chaos. Amidst the hum of taxis, the jazz riffs echoing down alleys, and the comforting bustle of 24-hour diners, a tragedy unfolded that shattered the city's tough exterior. It began in Brooklyn, in a modest two-room apartment, where two promising lives were brutally silenced in the middle of the night. What was once a sanctuary for young, hopeful souls became the stage for a heinous act that would leave even the most seasoned detectives questioning the darkness of humanity. On a chilly Tuesday morning, the first responders arrived on scene, summoned by panicked neighbors who reported strange noises during the night, thumps and muffled screams that seemed to pierce the steady soundtrack of the city. As officers approached the decrepit apartment complex with its graffiti-tagged bricks and flickering streetlights, none of them expected the horror waiting beyond that battered wooden door. Inside, the stench of coppery blood mixed with the stagnant odor of a small, unkempt apartment. The scene was as if ripped straight out of a nightmare. Blood smeared across the wooden floors, pooling beneath the lifeless, mutilated bodies of two victims. A young man in his early 20s sprawled on the floor, his throat gashed open so deeply that his windpipe gleamed pale through the congealed gore, and a woman, barely recognizable, crumpled on the tattered couch with her face eternally frozen in an expression of sheer terror. Detectives might have chalked it up to a botched burglary if not for the grotesque details left behind. The killer hadn't simply killed, he had performed a twisted ritual that would haunt everyone in the precinct for weeks. In the center of the small coffee table were the victims' wallets, emptied of cash, but strangely arranged next to a bloodied kitchen knife. Scribbled on the peeling yellowed wallpaper using the victim's own blood were the words, "Life owes me." The unsettling capitalization suggested an act not of desperation but of deliberate hatred, written perhaps with glee, or malice at the very least. The victims were identified shortly after the scene was processed. Josh Peterson, 22, was a graduate student at NYU, majoring in urban policy. Ambitious yet approachable, Josh was known for his bright smile and tireless advocacy for social justice. Beside him in the same apartment lay Emily Drake, 23, a freelance graphic designer with a talent for art and an even greater aptitude for bringing people together. They weren't a couple, but best friends sharing an apartment, often working late into the night from their makeshift desk by the window. It was there in their oasis of dreams and ambitions that their lives had come to an abrupt and violent end. Detective Abigail Monroe, a 10-year veteran of NYPD's Homicide Division, was first on the scene. She later recounted to the press that the brutality was unlike anything she'd witnessed before. "We see a lot of bad things in this line of work, but this was rage," she said, shaking her head. "This wasn't just about taking lives. This was personal. This was revenge. Revenge against the world." As detectives scoured the apartment for clues, a picture of the killer's methodical depravity began to emerge. The blood writing on the wall was just the beginning. Beneath Josh's bed, officers found a notebook that must have belonged to the killer, filled with incoherent ramblings about betrayal, injustice, and a deep-seated resentment for humanity. Phrases like "everyone deserves to bleed" and "hope is a liar's tool" covered entire pages. Alongside the notebook was a pair of worn gloves, soaked in blood and hastily shoved under the bed frame. These would later be collected for DNA analysis. The crime sent shockwaves rippling through the city. News of the double murder hit the front pages of every major newspaper. Monster at large in Brooklyn. On TV, news anchors speculated on whether New York had yet another serial killer in its midst, echoing memories of figures like the Son of Sam or the Zodiac Killer. Social media exploded with discussions and conspiracy theories, some claiming it to be a random act, while others believed it was part of an elaborate vendetta against millennials. For friends and family of the victims, none of this mattered. They gathered on the steps outside Emily and Josh's apartment that rainy Wednesday evening, lighting candles and choking back tears as they laid down flowers and notes in their memory. "Emily had this way of making you feel like you mattered," one teary-eyed mourner told reporters. "She was the friend who made you laugh on your worst days. The idea that someone would hurt her like this is just unspeakable." Over to the side, Josh's mother, clutching a photo of her son in his graduation robe, sobbed uncontrollably as his father held her, trying not to crumble himself. But for the NYPD, there was no room for grief. The hunt for the monster had begun. Frustratingly, there were no eyewitnesses. The deteriorated security camera in the building's lobby captured nothing but static. The killer had chosen his moment perfectly. However, neighbors provided one crucial detail that turned the case from perplexing to sinister. Some reported seeing a short, wiry man wearing a hoodie and dark jeans lingering around the stairwell days before the murders. No one thought much of him at the time. He looked too small, too ordinary to be a threat. "Whoever this was," Detective Monroe concluded at a press briefing, "he's not done yet." The warning was prophetic. Just weeks later, blood would spill again, this time in the vast, open plains of Texas, and the puzzle pieces of madness would fall closer together. The nation watched in horror as it became clear, Brooklyn wasn't a random act. It was just the beginning of a sinister cross-country rampage that blurred the lines between the ordinary and the incomprehensible. The second case, Darkness in Texas. Barely 2 weeks had passed since the horrors in New York City, and the nation was just beginning to catch its breath. The brutal murder of Emily Drake and Josh Peterson was still fresh, the headlines screaming about a possible monster, a specter who evaded capture and left nothing behind but carnage and cryptic blood-stained words. Somewhere in Brooklyn, fear still lingered in the air, but 1,700 miles south, in a quiet town nestled in the vast expanse of rural Texas, that fear had not yet arrived. Here, life carried on a little slower. The sunsets came earlier, the stars shone brighter. Small-town Texas thrived on community, church barbecues, and neighborly check-ins. The town of Eustis was no different. Ordinary, quiet, a place where bad news rarely traveled. But on one cold February night, the kind of bad news that no one prepared for came knocking. At the edge of town, down a narrow gravel road, sat a modest farmhouse, a one-story white house with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox. It was the home of James and Melanie Carter, a young couple in their late 20s who were eagerly awaiting the arrival of their first child. Melanie was 8 months pregnant, glowing with anticipation. Their house wasn't much, but it was theirs, bought with money James earned working long days in the oil fields. Their future was bright, their hope palpable, until that night. It started with a flicker. The porch light, a single old bulb swaying in the cold Texas wind, blinked off and on. Inside, a fire crackled in the wood-burning stove, its warm glow stretching across the small living room. Melanie reclined on the couch, meticulously knitting a baby blanket. James, seated nearby, flipped through channels on their decades-old TV, complaining about the lack of decent news coverage. "What's wrong with that light again?" Melanie asked, not lifting her eyes from the thread in her hands. "I'll check it later, babe," James replied casually, already half lost in a rerun of an old western. But neither of them got the chance to investigate. Unknown to them, the flickering wasn't because of bad wiring, and the shadow moving across their yard wasn't just a play of the light. The quiet soon broke. Around midnight, a faint creak of wood echoed from the back porch. James stirred slightly, accustomed to the occasional armadillo knocking over a garbage can. But the sound didn't stop. Another creak followed, and then, silence. Complete silence. Even the breeze seemed to die. Then came the crash. The back door splintered open, its hinges shrieking as it slammed against the wall. Glass shattered. The intruder moved quickly, efficiently, not waiting for hesitation. James leaped to his feet just as the first blow landed. A lead pipe slammed against his ribcage, dropping him to the floor with a sickening crack. Struggling to breathe, all he could see through the haze of pain was a wiry figure darting toward the living room. Melanie screamed, clutching her stomach as she fought to rise from the couch. "Leave us alone, please," she begged, but her cries only seemed to fuel the intruder's frenzy. In one swift motion he grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and turned toward the terrified woman. What happened next would not only destroy the Carter family, but unravel the fragile calm of their entire community. Melanie's body was found the next morning by her mother, who had stopped by to deliver breakfast. The room bore unmistakable signs of chaos. Blood pooled on the floors and seeped into the tatty couch upholstery. The walls bore deep gashes from the knife, as though the assailant's rage went beyond simply taking lives. In a sickening twist, the word promise was written across the wall in Melanie's blood. James's body was discovered in the kitchen. He didn't die quietly. His hands bore deep defensive wounds, fingers nearly severed, but the fatal blow had been to his head, a brutal strike that left the side of his skull caved in. Detectives would later determine that despite his injuries, James had fought until his last moments, likely dragging himself toward his wife in a futile attempt to protect her. By some miracle, however, there was a survivor. Melanie's unborn child, despite the brutal attack on her mother, had somehow been spared. Paramedics arrived just as her mother's anguished cries echoed across the property, and they performed an emergency delivery on the spot. The newborn, a 7-pound baby girl, was airlifted to a Dallas hospital, her cries marking the only thread of hope in an otherwise shattered household. An act of intensity, not chaos. From the start, investigators recognized that this wasn't a random act of violence. The nature of the attack, the precision, the overkill, and the chilling note scrawled on the wall pointed towards something much darker, a killer with a purpose. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment outburst, said Detective Mark Reyes, leading the case. It was intentional, methodical, brutal in a way that suggests meaning to him, even if we can't yet grasp it. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no reliable security cameras on the rural Carter property. But one clue emerged when officials discovered a small footprint left in the mud of the Carters' backyard. Size: approximately 7 men's, unusually small for an adult man. Too small to be James's, too fresh to be anyone else's, Reyes noted grimly. Rumors quickly spread in Eustis. Church prayer circles hummed with fear and speculation. Did the Carters owe someone money? Did James cross the wrong crew at the oil fields? Local bars filled with murmurs about a random drifter, a ghostly specter, someone who didn't belong, but no one ever questioned. A pattern emerges back in New York. Authorities compared notes when Texas investigators reached out. The blood-written words, "promise," on the Carter wall, mirrored the ominous, "life owes me," found in Brooklyn. The small footprint discovered outside the farmhouse also matched a similar print noted at Josh and Emily's apartment. It was becoming disturbingly clear this monster wasn't staying put. Worse, he wasn't done. As the case gained national media attention, fear quickly escalated in small towns across the Midwest. People began double-locking their doors, suspicious of even their longtime neighbors. Police briefings warned residents to sleep with porch lights on and report any unusual activity. "This doesn't seem like a crime driven by greed or desperation," Detective Reyes said in a hushed press conference. "It feels like this comes from a deep, disturbed place, perhaps even hatred for life itself." The hunt was on, but the killer moved like a phantom. He had no known connections, used no identifiable weapons, and left behind only his rage, etched in his victim's blood. Conclusion: fear, gripping the heartland. By the time a funeral was held for the Carters, the community of Eustis no longer felt ordinary. The darkness that had visited New York now shadowed Texas, and no one could predict where it would go next. The only certainty was this: the man who invaded their town had done so with purpose, and whoever he was, he would strike again. The chilling crime scenes are rarely pristine. They are chaotic, a collage of heartbreak and human suffering. But what this killer left behind was something entirely different. Methodical madness wrought with an unsettling purpose. Every space he touched felt like it had been turned inside out, reeking not just of blood but of his twisted psyche. Each gruesome detail painted a dark portrait of someone who didn't merely kill, but sought to shock, to send a message, to make his victims and maybe even society pay attention. A scene torn from nightmares. The first responders were the first to break the barrier that separated everyday life from the surreal horror waiting beyond the door. They were greeted with the harsh stench of blood and burnt fabric. It wasn't the metallic tang of fresh blood but something richer, heavier, death that had lingered. The air itself seemed to suffocate, thick with rot, decay, and senseless violence. The walls were streaked with grotesque tributes to the killer's rage. Smears of blood had been used as a crude paintbrush to scrawl cryptic messages like "promise" and "life owes me," glaring back from the tattered wallpaper as though the words themselves were alive. Light bulbs above cast a faint flickering glow over the room, adding an almost theatrical feel to the macabre display, as if the killer wanted the whole scene illuminated, his madness center stage. No corner of the room had been spared from his wrath. Furniture lay upturned, the legs of chairs snapped as if someone had smashed them in a fit of fury. A stuffed child's teddy bear sat abandoned in the corner, its soft fabric soaked in blood, its once happy button eyes looking disjointed against the overwhelming violence of the space. The bodies. Victims as his message. But the centerpiece of the horror was always his victims. They weren't just murdered, they were staged like grotesque art installations, left in ways that stripped them of dignity and humanity. Each victim's body told a story, not just of violence but of the killer's deep-seated contempt for human life. In Brooklyn, the young student couple became his unwilling canvas. Josh Peterson's body lay sprawled on the living room floor, one arm bent grotesquely beneath him. His throat had been slashed so deeply that his head was barely still attached to his shoulders, the exposed sinews and bone glinting beneath dried blood. His eyes, half open, seemed to still gaze blankly at the killer's message scrawled across the wall. Emily Drake wasn't just killed, she became his final statement. Her crumpled body lay on the worn-out couch, legs hanging unnaturally off the side. Her hands had been bound with the same knitting yarn she had used just days earlier to create handmade scarves, what was once a sign of her creativity and hope, cruelly reduced to a tool of restraint. Her face, frozen in an expression of primal terror, stared upward, as if she died with the image of her killer burned into her memory. In Texas, Melanie Carter, 8 months pregnant with her unborn child, was left in an even more chilling state. As though sending an emphatic signature, her murderer scrawled another bloodied message, this time on her kitchen wall. Promise. Blood was everywhere, splattered, smeared, dripping in thick rivulets down the walls and pooling on the faded linoleum floors. Her baby, somehow spared, was the only evidence of any mercy, though there was nothing merciful about what he'd done. The killer's art of chaos. What made the crime scenes even more disturbing was the apparent deliberation in every detail. The blood messages weren't hastily written in a frantic moment of passion, they were neatly styled with sharp, jagged lines that suggested he took his time. Investigators noted the curious capitalization and perfectly even spacing of letters. Was he making demands, declaring war, or pouring his grievance into the walls for all to see? His choice of weapons was brutal and raw. Kitchen knives, blunt objects lying around, and even personal items belonging to the victims themselves. But to him, these weren't just tools of killing. To him, they were extensions of his anger. In one case, he used a coffee carafe to bludgeon his victim after smashing it against the table to create jagged edges. Broken glass from picture frames became makeshift daggers he pressed into flesh. Even stranger were the seemingly insignificant artifacts he chose to leave behind. A notebook under the bed in New York contained ramblings in barely legible handwriting. Fragments of sentences like, "They all stare," and "Truth is cancer, lie to survive," scrawled on crumpled pages. In Texas, they found a single thimble sitting upright on the bloody kitchen counter with no explanation as to why it was there. A killer driven by design, not chaos. Seasoned homicide detectives shook their heads as they walked through the scenes. The brutal efficiency of the killings contrasted so jarringly with the madness, as though the killer carefully calculated how to make his murders feel chaotic, when in truth, every gruesome detail was a part of his inner plan. Bloodstains on multiple walls hinted at deliberate moments where bodies were moved, repositioned, and likely tortured. The markings on victims' skin, a combination of deep stab wounds and slashes, showed skill too. The killer knew how to inflict pain, not randomly but with surgical precision. Melanie Carter's defensive wounds, strong and deep, were evidence of a fight that lasted longer than most killers would allow. But he let it play out, savoring the terror. Every crime scene hinted at the same thing. This killer wasn't hasty. He wanted them to suffer, and he wanted us all to see it, detecting the devil behind the details. For detectives, these grisly scenes weren't just about collecting evidence. They were about understanding the mind behind the madness. What sort of man meticulously planned out the destruction of lives while leaving behind breadcrumbs just cryptic enough to taunt his pursuers? In the mud outside the Carter home, for example, a single fresh footprint led investigators to understand two key things. 1, he was likely smaller than most men his age. 2, he wasn't careful enough to erase his tracks, which likely meant he felt confident, overconfident, about not being caught. One detective said it felt as if the killer was leaving us a story, paragraph by blood-covered paragraph, daring us to piece it all together. The aftermath, a scene that haunts every person who entered one of his crime scenes, from the first responder to the rookie cop, seemed to carry a piece of that room with them, long after they left. Months later, some would still be haunted by the smell of dried blood, the streaks of red that would never scrub themselves fully out of their memories. These crime scenes weren't just where people died, they were crucibles of human pain, shrines to a killer's warped vision for the world, and lasting scars on the communities they touched. In the end, each room he touched stopped being just a crime scene. It became a scar on the map of America, a reminder of how close the darkness can come to any of us, how no lock, no light, no prayer in the night is guaranteed to keep monsters out. Widespread panic news travels fast, especially in America, where 24-hour news cycles feed on the extraordinary, the terrifying, and the unimaginable. And nothing captured fear and morbid curiosity more completely than the sudden emergence of a cold-blooded killer, a shadow terrorizing neighborhoods, targeting innocent lives, and leaving behind cryptic, blood-written messages. As the body count grew, the country's mood shifted, from initial shock to collective dread, to outright hysteria. This wasn't just a killer, it was a national nightmare. A monster in the media's spotlight. The media latched onto the story like vultures on a carcass. Morning talk shows, crime podcasts, and cable news anchors dissected every detail of the Brooklyn and Texas murders. Networks rolled dramatic headlines in bold, blood-red fonts. The devil in disguise, a monster among us, bloody promises. It was all anyone seemed to talk about. Graphics of New York and Texas appeared on TV screens, markers connecting locations as though mapping out a serial killer's grotesque road trip. Each newscast rehashed the details of the murders, sometimes sensationalized for ratings, sometimes painfully vague due to the lack of real answers. Analysts speculated about the psychological meaning behind words like "life owes me" and "promise." Was it a killer lashing out against society? A deprived and unseen person fighting a twisted internal war? Or was he simply evil personified? Social media naturally went into overdrive. Hashtags like #AmericanDevil and #WhoIsHe trended nationally as theories ran rampant. Reddit threads filled with amateur detectives spun webs of speculation. Was the killer targeting young couples? Was he hitting places with old security systems? Some even debated if the cryptic words left behind were clues to his next location, turning countless small neighborhoods into self-declared crime-solving hotbeds. "It's like we're living inside our own horror movie," one woman tweeted, echoing the growing paranoia that clutched the nation. "Except we're all the victims, just waiting for our turn." The fear in the neighborhood's panic doesn't need to be logical to spread. It just needs fuel. And this killer provided plenty. Parents in Brooklyn began enforcing strict curfews, their once carefree children now herded home before sunset. Local hardware stores reported an uptick in the sale of locks, chain barriers, and motion sensor lights. Stores that sold security cameras, especially in small towns like Eustis, Texas, found their shelves wiped clean in days. In suburban America, where front doors were often left unlocked and streets were brimming with trust, the killer injected an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. In Eustis, neighbors stopped waving at one another from their porches and started peering suspiciously from behind curtains. Walking your dog in the evening suddenly felt like courting death, every shadow a threat, every stranger a murderer in disguise. Churches, in both Brooklyn and small southern towns, held special candlelit vigils, praying for the lost souls of the victims, and for those still living under the ominous cloud of danger. Communities banded together in search of answers when authorities seemed baffled. Neighborhood watch groups sprang up seemingly overnight, complete with late-night patrols and unofficial militia members, despite protestations from local law enforcement. People became their own first line of defense, their trust in institutions weakening more with every murder. "I used to let my kids play out back until bedtime," muttered Sandra Rowe, a mother of 3 in Eustis. "Now I don't even let them out of my sight at the park during daylight. We don't know where he'll show up next." Small towns turned suspicious. For small towns across the Midwest, the unknown was the most terrifying element of all. The lack of personal connection to the killer, or any apparent motive, made him even more ominous. In many locations, residents were accustomed to knowing everyone's business. But someone who seemed ordinary, someone small and wiry, blending into the background, shook their sense of safety to the core. Stores installed new surveillance cameras. Some hired armed off-duty officers to walk the aisles. Property values in affected areas plummeted as suburban families debated moving somewhere farther away from crime. As one Texan pastor dramatically lamented during a Sunday sermon, "The devil walks among us and none of us knows his name." At the same time, the scarcity of leads caused many townspeople to cast suspicion on outsiders. The rare drifter hitching a ride through a rural corridor was often met with side-eyed glances or outright confrontations. Gas station attendants began keeping baseball bats under counters. Strangers were questioned, sometimes with hostility, about why they were passing through. "People don't act like this, not around here," said an elderly veteran sipping coffee at Eustis's only diner. His words spoke to the surreal atmosphere of fear that blanketed community after community. "We're suspicious of our own neighbors now, and that's when you know something's really wrong." Police overwhelmed and pressured for law enforcement, this national frenzy presented an increasingly difficult challenge. The NYPD's homicide detectives worked closely with their Texas counterparts, sharing what little they could glean from the sparse evidence. But even in a world brimming with advanced forensic tools and surveillance technology, the killer's ability to move unseen was baffling. There were no reliable fingerprints, no weapon left behind, save improvised instruments that revealed nothing. The only clue was the blood messages, and even those seemed less like a trail of breadcrumbs and more like taunting graffiti left to mock the investigators. Public criticism mounted as the killer struck twice without so much as a hint of who he was. At every press conference, reporters fired endless questions about why the crime scenes had yielded so few leads. Were the New York and Texas murders linked? If so, what state would be next? Was this an organized serial killer? And could law enforcement step ahead before another town was painted in blood? Officials tried to quiet the nationwide uproar. FBI spokespeople assured the public a task force was being assembled, investigators were following multiple credible leads, but these assurances did little to calm citizens already too paranoid to sleep through the night. "It's not just the murders," Detective Monroe explained wearily during a press briefing in Brooklyn. "It's the way he makes you question everyone and everything around you. That's the real terror he's selling." The nation holds its breath. By now the murders had surpassed local tragedies and become woven into the fabric of American consciousness. Community bulletin boards filled with warnings to look out for suspicious figures. Conspiracy theories spread faster than wildfire. People called tip lines to report innocent pedestrians who fit the general description of the killer. Wiry and small, flooding police databases with reports that ultimately led nowhere. Entire towns would enter lockdown at the slightest murmurs of strange happenings. "Like the boogeyman," one New York mother told the local news, clutching her young son as she spoke, "except he's not hiding under beds, he's in plain sight, but we don't know who or where he is." By the second month of the spree, fear wasn't isolated to any one region or specific group. From sprawling southern ranches to northern apartment complexes, a collective unease threaded through every pocket of American life. He never announced his next target. He never warned. And because of this, everyone, not just his victims, felt vulnerable. The killer's most potent weapon wasn't the knife he used or the messages he wrote on walls. It was the uncertainty, the paranoia, the realization that he could be walking among them, lying in wait. The investigation team and the first clue. For detectives, the hardest part of chasing a killer isn't always the hunt itself, it's starting the hunt. With no name, no face, and no motive to work with, any semblance of order or clarity was drowned in a sea of chaos. And yet, when those first reports rolled in from Brooklyn, New York, whispers of a brutal double homicide spreading among law enforcement circles, investigators had no idea they were embarking on what would become one of the most intense cross-country manhunts in modern American history. Assembling the team. It began in a cramped precinct in the heart of New York City. The NYPD's Homicide Division, already overworked and underfunded, was tasked with solving what initially seemed like an isolated but unusually brutal crime, the killing of two young friends, Josh Peterson and Emily Drake, in their shared apartment. Detective Abigail Monroe, a 10-year veteran of the force and known for her methodical approach, was tasked with leading the case. Monroe's instincts kicked in the moment she stepped into the blood-soaked apartment. This wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. It wasn't a lover's quarrel or a vengeful grudge. The vivid, calculated rage splashed across the walls, the cruel staging of the victims, and the blood-written words, "Life owes me," screamed of something much darker. It was within minutes of observing the crime scene that she leaned over to her partner, Detective Sean Torres, and muttered, "We're not just looking for a killer, we're looking for a message. This guy has something to say." By the time similar grisly details emerged at the Carter residence in rural Texas just 2 weeks later, cryptic blood messages on the walls, overkill of the victims, and eerie staging, it became disastrously clear this wasn't contained to New York. The killer was mobile. He wasn't just hunting in one state. Detective Monroe's case had grown tentacles, threatening to spill onto federal territory. In the following days, the FBI was called in to assist, officially forming a joint task force to prevent the widening panic gripping the nation. The team now included agents specializing in behavioral analysis, forensic psychologists, and the experienced boots-on-the-ground detectives from New York and Texas. The task force was a patchwork of expertise, but one thing united them: time was running out, and they couldn't afford another bloodbath. The uncovering of the first clue. Despite the chaos of the two crime scenes, one detail stood out. Amidst the wreckage of Josh Peterson and Emily Drake's apartment in Brooklyn, an overlooked pair of leather gloves lay shoved beneath the bed frame. At first they seemed trivial, something the killer might have stolen or even dropped accidentally. But closer examination revealed their significance. They weren't just gloves. They were soaked in blood. The initial lab results further piqued interest. The gloves contained DNA belonging to Josh and Emily, but also, crucially, an unidentified third party. Was this an oversight by the killer? An intentional breadcrumb meant to taunt? Monroe couldn't shake the suspicion that the gloves meant more than they seemed. "This guy wants us to follow him," said Monroe as she stared at crime scene photos pinned to her office wall. "He's enjoying this. We weren't meant to find a knife or a murder weapon, but these gloves, they're a hook. He's reeling us in." The detective sent the gloves to the FBI's Advanced Criminal DNA database, and while it ruled out most suspects in the National Registry, it didn't conclusively identify their target. What it did, however, was give the team its first true physical evidence. In Texas, a similar breadcrumb would soon emerge. Beneath the chaos of the Carter home, investigators recovered a size 7 muddy footprint left etched in dirt near the kickplate of the back door. It wasn't much, but combined with the gloves from New York, they established a pattern. The killer wasn't as infallible as he wanted them to believe. These clues, though small, weren't just evidence, they were humanizing. As grotesque and calculating as the murderer seemed, the gloves and footprints hinted at his errors, his leave-behinds. He was a predator, yes, but also prone to mistake, reminding investigators that underneath the facade of terror lay a real person. That meant in turn that he could be stopped. Behavioral analysis and the criminal profile. As evidence began to stack up, however fragmented, it became clear that cracking the killer's psyche would be as important as analyzing physical evidence. That's when the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, entered the picture, focusing their expertise on crafting a profile of the suspect based on the signatures and brutality he left behind. The wall writings, "Life owes me in New York, promise in Texas," revealed a mindset steeped in resentment, bitterness, and entitlement. "This isn't random," observed psychologist Dr. Marion Kane. "Whoever this is feels deeply wronged. He's not lashing out at individual victims. That writing isn't meant for them, it's for us, it's for society." Dr. Kane theorized that the killer was likely a man in his 30s or 40s, someone who'd lived long enough to accumulate personal grievances and perceived injustices. He was methodical, possibly intelligent, but emotionally fractured. "This isn't someone who acts out of passion," Kane explained further. "He's cold, he's controlled. He wants people to see his pain, to feel his hate for the world." The size 7 footprint found near the Carter's home reinforced theories about his physicality. The killer wasn't an imposing figure. He likely stood no taller than 5'7" with a slight build. This detail only further defied expectations of what a brutal murderer might look like, throwing off neighbors and bystanders who might otherwise be more alert. Technology meets the chase. With sparse physical evidence and no witnesses, investigators turned to technology to try and track the killer's elusive movements. The timeline between the Brooklyn murders and the attack on the Carters in Texas pointed to one troubling conclusion. The killer drove. This wasn't just an opportunistic spree fueled by impulse. Road tolls, highway cameras, and even credit card transactions across multiple states were scrutinized for irregularities. Detective Monroe once joked with Torres late one night, half smirking over a cup of stale coffee. "He's probably driving some beat-up old Ford and laughing at every toll booth camera he glides under." But they weren't wrong. Investigators later found grainy footage from a Midwest rest stop that captured the silhouette of a man fitting the killer's build, stepping into a rusted sedan and driving westward. Unfortunately, the footage lacked clarity, and the license plate was unreadable. Still, it proved one vital point. He was mobile, shifting gatherings of evidence from local jurisdictions to the federal web of investigation. Every hour he stayed free was one closer to another potential target. Tensions rising. But despite these small victories, DNA, a partial footprint and surveillance, they still had no name, no face and no motive sturdy enough to hang a lead on. Tensions began to rise within the team. The press was relentless, fueling public fear with stories about a ghost killer taunting authorities. "The American Devil!" one headline screamed, as if to mock the progress investigators had yet to make. "What are we missing?" Torres exclaimed in frustration during one of many late-night strategy meetings. "This guy isn't invisible. He didn't just drop out of the sky." But what if he had? The growing frustration wasn't just in the squad room, it extended to a public now terrified, watching every shadow in their neighborhoods. "We need to deliver something," Monroe reminded her task force, the exhaustion crackling in her voice. "Because I'll tell you this, he's delivering something right back to us, and it's blood." The path ahead. Armed with the scant but significant physical evidence alongside the profile painted by forensic psychology, investigators doubled down. They knew the killer was smart, but he wasn't infallible. The hidden details, the gloves, the footprint, the rest stop silhouette were breadcrumbs, and this murderer, like anyone else, could trip up. With the nation watching and dreading, detectives put their faith in the idea that if he'd made mistakes once, he would again. The gloves had been the first whisper in the dark. Now, they were waiting for the next move, the next crack in his mask. The dark past of the killer. Behind every monster lies a story, a fractured mosaic of choices, tragedies, and dark turns. This killer wasn't an exception, though uncovering the pieces of his past was no easy task. He seemed, at first glance, like a ghost, untraceable, anonymous, a walking void, but with time, persistence, and growing evidence, investigators began peeling back the layers of his life to reveal a haunting tale of desperation, abuse, and unrelenting rage. Who he had become made headlines around the nation. But who he had been, the boy, the son, the neighbor, was what confounded those who once crossed his path. A man without ties, yet burdened by years of silent grievance. A man defined as much by his atrocities as by his invisibility before them. A childhood in the shadows. Born in the late 1980s to a family mired in poverty, the killer, identified later as Vernon Ray Mercer, grew up in a small forgotten town in rural Alabama. It was the type of place people rarely left or aspired to leave. The main street was dotted with decaying storefronts, and rusted mailboxes leaned precariously on dirt roads leading to shabby clapboard houses. Life didn't offer many opportunities in Mercer's hometown, and those who managed to escape rarely looked back. Mercer's parents, according to sketchy welfare records, married young and fought often. His father, Raymond Mercer, was a factory worker in the only remaining industrial plant in the area, though locals said he spent as much time drinking and fighting in grimy roadside bars as he did earning wages. His mother, Evelyn, stayed home but wasn't kind or nurturing. By all accounts, her mood swung violently, often erupting with fury that ended with a young Mercer huddling in terrified silence in the corner of his room. "Poor kid never had a chance," an old neighbor later recalled in an interview with a local reporter. "You didn't have to be a genius to figure out something real bad was happening in that house. You'd hear the yelling, the banging of fists on walls. Evelyn was a piece of work herself, mean, cold. Ray was no better. The whole family was rotten through, if you ask me." At school, Vernon didn't fare much better. Small for his age, quiet to the point of causing concern, and perpetually unkempt, he was an easy target for bullies. Teachers described him as withdrawn, often retreating into the back corner of the classroom, scribbling strange drawings onto the margins of his notebook. He was the type of child classmates didn't notice, or, worse, avoided. "They said he was too weak to fight back, too weird to fit in," remarked a former teacher who remembered the boy only faintly. "He'd never look you in the eye, even when you praised his work. I tried to get through to him once, asked him to stay after class one day. He just stared at his shoes the whole time. Never said a word." When Vernon turned 11, the tenuous stability of his life shattered. His father abandoned the family and disappeared, leaving nothing but debts and a broken truck in their yard. Evelyn, who had relied on Raymond's factory earnings, meager as they were, spiraled further into rage and resentment. Her anger, already directed at her son on occasion, now seemed to find him as its permanent host. Vernon's body bore the marks of her frustrations, though he rarely mentioned them. "Came in one day with a burn mark on his arm," an old family friend remembered. "Said he'd fallen against the stove, but I knew better. Looked like he'd been grabbed, held there. But what could you do back then? You don't report those things in a place like this. You just feel sorry for the poor boy and turn your head." It was during this period that neighbors said Vernon began disappearing for hours, sometimes days. He prowled local woodlands on foot, alone under the shadows of pines or perched silently by the edge of a nearby creek, tossing stones into the murky water. To some it seemed like he was running from a home he couldn't bear to return to. To others, it was an escape into whatever alternate world he could conjure for himself, the making of a hermit. By the time Mercer hit his teenage years, whatever fragile ties tethered him to society had begun to disintegrate. He dropped out of school before finishing 9th grade. The few peers who might have remembered him said he barely spoke, always avoiding confrontation, his wiry frame cutting an unremarkable shadow through their paths. Their comments painted a picture of a boy neither loved nor hated, just forgotten. "I don't think anyone noticed when he stopped showing up at school," one former classmate admitted decades later. "He didn't hang with us, didn't play football, didn't go to church events. I barely knew he was there to begin with. Just some skinny kid in oversized clothes who drifted around the edges of things." After dropping out, Vernon spent much of his time bouncing between temporary labor jobs. He worked scrap yards, loaded trucks, even cleaned slaughterhouses. Not the kind of jobs people wanted to keep, but the kind that didn't require references. One former employer described him as punctual but unsettling. "All I remember is he kept to himself," this employer said. "Didn't joke with the other boys, didn't talk much unless you asked him something straight on. But once, I caught him standing in the corner of the yard, just staring into nothing. 15 minutes went by before I finally walked up and shouted at him to get back to work. Never understood that boy. Loneliness and twisting resentment. As Mercer aged, it became clear that his detachment wasn't the sort that healed with time. He avoided women, unable or unwilling to form connections, and seemed to see others as little more than obstacles in a world that, in his mind, had no place for him. His mother, Evelyn, passed away when Mercer was 22. By then, their relationship was little more than shared bitterness under the same roof. She died in debt, leaving Vernon with a dilapidated house he rarely maintained, and a growing resentment toward the idea of family, love, or stability. To Mercer, life was a ledger of debts unpaid, debts he believed the world itself owed him. By his mid-30s, Mercer was living a nomadic existence. He drifted between small towns, never staying long, taking odd jobs to scrape by. No records pointed to violent incidents during this time, but neighbors in the areas he passed through would years later recall vague, uneasy interactions. A man who never smiled, never spoke unless asked, and avoided eye contact like it was a learned habit. The breaking point. Though investigators pieced together the broad strokes of Mercer's life, what finally triggered his descent into murder and ritualistic violence remained elusive. Some speculated it was the isolation, years of slipping further from normal human connection until all that remained was hate. Others believed it was a life riddled with perceived failures, culminating in his need for revenge. Whatever the cause, when Mercer finally crossed the line in Brooklyn, ending the lives of two hopeful young adults in a senseless act of hatred, it was clear he wasn't just lashing out at his victims, he was declaring war on the world that, in his mind, had wronged him. Detective Monroe summed it up grimly during one interview. People like him don't wake up one day and decide to kill. It's years of soaking in rage, years of rehearsing the blame until it feels like truth. He didn't just want to be seen, he wanted to be feared. Psychological analysis. Enemy of society. The chilling murders carried out by Vernon Ray Mercer weren't just expressions of personal rage, they were declarations of war. War against the very fabric of society that he believed had betrayed him, dismissed him, and reduced him to nothing but a shadow living on the edges of existence. To Mercer, each life that he extinguished wasn't merely a victim. Every death was a statement, a twisted message written in blood, aimed at a world he loathed beyond comprehension. But what drives someone to this level of hatred? What contorts a human mind into such remorseless violence, where victims become pawns in a larger vendetta? To understand Vernon Mercer was to step into the wounded, savage depths of his psyche, a journey into a reality where isolation, failure, and resentment converge, leaving only the void in their wake. The killer's need for control. Early in their analysis, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, came to a sobering conclusion. Mercer's crimes weren't impulsive acts of rage. They were deliberate, calculated. He wielded his violence the way an artist holds a paintbrush, carefully crafting scenes meant to horrify, terrify, and dominate. The placement of victims, the blood-written messages, none of this was done in haste, said Dr. Marion Kane, a clinical forensic psychologist brought into the case. The methodical nature tells us something crucial. This man didn't simply want to kill, he wanted control. He wanted to leave a mark. Control, Kane explained, was something Mercer likely felt robbed of throughout his life. From his abusive childhood to his years of being overlooked and invisible, Mercer was always at the mercy of others. His parents controlled him through violence. His bullies controlled him through humiliation. Society itself controlled him through poverty, alienation, and a lack of opportunity. By committing these heinous crimes, Mercer reclaimed a warped sense of power, choosing exactly how and when his victims would die, and ensuring their deaths would haunt the living. When he killed, he wasn't just playing God, Kane added. He was punishing everyone who ignored him, underestimated him, or dared to have something he convinced himself he could never have. A deep-rooted resentment for humanity. Through his crimes, Mercer's resentment for humanity became abundantly clear. Witness a simple detail, the words scrawled on the walls in blood. In Brooklyn it was, "Life owes me." In Texas, the chilling promise. Each phrase wasn't just a random choice, they were mantras, glimpses into the depths of his anger. Kane described these phrases as anchor points, the psychological foundation of Mercer's hatred. Life owes me wasn't just a vague sentiment, it was a personal manifesto. Mercer genuinely appeared to believe that the world had taken something from him, though what that something was remained abstract, even to himself. Love, respect, security, Likely all of it, but none in terms he could articulate. His words on the walls reflect a mind that's fractured. Deliberate, yes, but fractured, Kane explained. To Mercer, every person he killed was a representation of the life that denied him what he felt entitled to. A happy couple, a young dreamer, a family. It didn't matter who they were. What mattered was what they symbolized to him. Happiness, stability, all the things that he believed were out of his reach. Isolation as the catalyst. One of the major factors that sealed Mercer's descent into violence was his profound isolation. He wasn't just lonely, he was cut off from everything and everyone that could have kept him tethered to normality. Studies on behavior often show how social alienation can twist a person's worldview. In Mercer's case, it metastasized his bitterness into violence. "No one exists in a vacuum," Kane said. "Even the angriest or most damaged person has someone who changes their course, a mentor, a friend, someone who gives them just enough light to see things differently." But Mercer didn't have that. To him, the world was shadows, and as the years passed, those shadows became all he knew. His isolation wasn't just circumstantial, it evolved into a choice. At a certain point, Mercer stopped trying to connect with others, and instead leaned into his bitterness and mistrust. The very lack of human contact that might have saved him only reinforced his worldview, that everyone else existed on another plane of existence, far removed and inaccessible to someone like him. A profile of obsession. The notes recovered at the crime scenes, those scrawled ramblings left under beds and stuffed into drawers, were invaluable for investigators as they worked to piece together who Mercer was. Though chaotic, fragmented, and nonsensical at times, these writings betrayed a mind that was obsessed, driven, but also calculated. Phrases like, "they all stare," "truth is cancer," and "I am owed everything" repeated throughout his journals. Psychologists concluded that these weren't random thought processes but the foundation of an internal narrative Mercer had rehearsed for years. To him, his murders weren't crimes. They were acts of self-assertion, a way to force the world to see the pain it had caused him. One of the more eerie observations from his journals came from Dr. Kane. He's not writing for himself, he's writing for us, for whoever would uncover his notes. He wanted us to read these words, feel his anger, and maybe even empathize with him. In some ways it's his clearest communication to the world he felt never listened to him. A misdirection through appearance. One of the most dangerous aspects of Mercer's psychological profile was his ability to remain unnoticed. Small, wiry, unassuming, he seemed to vanish into the background wherever he went. Numerous witnesses described him the same way, a man people barely noticed. "It's an unusual advantage for someone who commits crimes this intentionally," said FBI agent Julian Harris, who oversaw the Joint Task Force. "Most serial killers either stand out because of their look, their habits, or their need for attention, but Mercer? He was different. He didn't want to be remembered, at least not while he was alive. He wanted his acts to burn into people's minds, not his name or his face." This played directly into his ability to evade capture for so long. Mercer never stayed in one place. He never formed attachments. He didn't indulge in the kind of habits that might have raised a red flag. Instead, he spent years perfecting the art of invisibility, turning ordinary moments of interaction with strangers into forgettable encounters. The enemy of society. By the time the task force pieced together Mercer's psychological profile, the concept of an enemy of society came to define him. He wasn't lashing out at specific people or institutions. He was lashing out at the very idea of society itself. Mercer was the ghost of all the overlooked, the forgotten, and the marginalized. But instead of finding redemption in that identity, he turned it into his weapon. "What makes Mercer so dangerous is that his hatred isn't personal," Dr. Kane said. "It's universal. That's why there's no pattern to his victims. He didn't care who they were as individuals. What mattered was what their existence represented to him. Normalcy, family, dreams, everything he decided he couldn't have and had to destroy. To him, it was righteous, even justifiable." Conclusion: the abyss. In the end, Vernon Mercer was more than just a murderer. He was a product of decades of pain, bitterness, and unaddressed psychological wounds. A man lost so far down the path of hate that returning was no longer an option. His blood-written messages, his careful but savage crimes, all spoke to a mind that had turned itself into its own worst enemy. Mercer didn't just want revenge, Kane concluded. He wanted validation. He wanted the world to see his pain, not so it would heal him but so he could inflict it right back. That was his ultimate goal, to make society feel his suffering, and in his mind, he succeeded. The nationwide manhunt. When it became clear that Vernon Ray Mercer wasn't just a local menace but a specter capable of striking fear across multiple states, law enforcement realized they were not simply facing a murderer. They were facing a national crisis. The murders in Brooklyn and rural Texas were not isolated incidents but pieces of a larger, more sinister puzzle, and solving it would take an unprecedented level of cooperation, technology, dogged determination, and luck. What began as two disconnected, nightmarish crime scenes exploded into a full-blown nationwide manhunt gripping America by its very core. The killer's ability to move seamlessly across state lines, leaving horror in his wake, forced law enforcement to respond with urgency and strategy like never before. As the nation held its breath, investigators launched one of the most intense and sprawling searches in modern American history. The task force forms. The hunt for Vernon Mercer marked one of the rare occasions when local, state, and federal agencies worked together without the usual bureaucratic red tape or territorial squabbling. In the aftermath of the murders in Eustis, Texas, the FBI officially declared Vernon Mercer a national fugitive and created an interstate task force led jointly by the Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, and special agents specializing in violent crimes. Detective Abigail Monroe of the NYPD, who had been on the ground for the Brooklyn case, was brought in as a field coordinator. Her hands-on experience with the initial bloody crime scene and her unrelenting determination to stop Mercer made her the ideal choice to unify local officers with federal resources. "We're not just chasing a killer," Monroe announced during the team's first closed-door briefing. "We're chasing a ghost, but all ghosts leave traces behind, and we will find him." The task force's mandate was clear, but daunting. Track Mercer down, connect the dots between his crimes, and unearth his next target before another tragedy struck. With support from field offices across the country, they divided the investigation into three main fronts: analyzing Mercer's methods, following his physical trail, and preventing the growing panic from spiraling into chaos. A killer gone mobile. One of the defining traits of Vernon Mercer as a fugitive was his mobility. Unlike most killers who operated within a familiar territory or hunting ground, Mercer broke all conventional patterns. He was a drifter, unbound to routines, communities, or relationships. Police couldn't rely on the standard geographic profiling used for serial killers because Mercer didn't stay in one place long enough to develop a comfort zone. His home wasn't a person, a town, or a house. It was the road. Investigators painstakingly reconstructed his movements by cross-referencing interstate toll records, surveillance camera footage from gas stations and convenience stores, and even eyewitness accounts of a wiry, unassuming stranger spotted in diners or truck stops. But despite the abundance of digital surveillance in the modern world, Mercer remained frustratingly difficult to pin down. "Mercer is a hunter, not a grazer," explained FBI agent Julian Harris during a press conference. "He moves like a predator stalking his prey, carefully, quietly, with purpose. And then he disappears before anyone can track the echo of his footsteps." It didn't help that Mercer was meticulous in avoiding modern technology. He drove older, unregistered vehicles he likely bought second-hand for cash, avoiding digital paper trails. He used no credit cards, no cell phone, and had no permanent address. His movements were erratic but intentional, as if he had rehearsed the art of vanishing long before his killing spree began. Mercer's taunting nature. While Mercer took great care to avoid being physically caught, he seemed to delight in leaving behind psychological breadcrumbs that taunted the investigators on his trail. At each crime scene, his blood-scrawled messages were like grim signatures, daring law enforcement to stop him. But his boldest act came just a month after the Eustis murders, when he returned to the site of his first crime in Brooklyn. It was a move no one had predicted. On a quiet night in March, an NYPD officer patrolling the crime scene noticed a faint light flickering inside the apartment where Josh Peterson and Emily Drake had been murdered. By the time reinforcements arrived, Mercer was long gone, but he'd left behind another haunting detail. On a section of the wall that had been scrubbed of its original bloody message, "Life owes me," Mercer had written a new taunt in bright red spray paint: "You won't catch me." "He's not just running," Monroe muttered after seeing the message. "He's playing cat and mouse with us, and he thinks he's the cat." This brazen act of defiance sent shockwaves through both the task force and the media. The implication was clear: Mercer wasn't just fleeing, he was watching. He was always one step ahead, and he wanted everyone to know it. Federal technology meets a killer's simplicity. Even with Mercer's manipulation of the environment to his advantage, the manhunt was backed by the full strength of technological innovation. Federal databases processed hundreds of eyewitness tips daily, and advanced algorithms compared surveillance footage to identify potential matches. License plate recognition systems scoured recordings from thousands of intersections and toll booths across America. Forensic experts double-checked every small clue. Treads from Mercer's sneakers, captured at several scenes, hinted at a specialty brand rarely found in big-box stores. His writing style was analyzed by linguists, who noted peculiar linguistic quirks that suggested Mercer might have spent time in certain southern regions. A piece of dirt found in the sole of his boot was traced to a quarry in Montana, narrowing potential hiding spots. But Mercer's simplicity, a life lived off the grid, actively worked against the investigators. Detective Torres, Monroe's partner, likened the challenge to trying to catch a fish in a lake the size of the entire country, using nothing but a broken rod, a public gripped by fear. Mercer's cunning and elusiveness meant one thing for the American public: panic. News of the manhunt dominated front pages and evening broadcasts. Social media exploded as hashtags like #MercerManhunt and #AmericanDevil trended for weeks. Amateur sleuths pored over crime scene photos and timelines, spinning countless conspiracy theories. Was there more than one killer? Did Mercer have an accomplice? Was he moving according to some secret code in the messages he left behind? Small-town communities locked down like never before? Gun stores reported record sales of firearms and ammunition as frightened citizens armed themselves against the phantom killer. In neighborhoods across the Midwest, normally unassuming townsfolk formed neighborhood watch groups, most armed to the teeth. Parents refused to let their children play outside after dark, while the sound of a car engine on a quiet street was enough to send curtains twitching in suspicion. "None of us feel safe anymore," remarked a woman in Chicago, even though Mercer had never been spotted anywhere near the city. "He could be anywhere. He could be here right now, and we wouldn't even know it." The first break. The key breakthrough came not from science but from sheer human perseverance. An observant trucker passing through a desolate stretch of Montana noticed a broken-down sedan abandoned off the side of a rural highway. Suspicious of the timing, he called local authorities. Upon inspection, they discovered items in the car that linked directly to Mercer: a bloodied notebook filled with his maddening ramblings and a small knife hidden under the driver's seat. For the first time, they had a definitive sign that Mercer was in Montana. This sparked a movement of law enforcement toward the remote stretches of the Rockies, where Mercer hoped to disappear forever among the rugged wilderness. A manhunt like no other. The fugitive task force closed in from every direction, slowly closing the net around Mercer as helicopters swept the forested landscapes and tracking dogs scoured his trail. Law enforcement agencies, big and small, united under one goal: to bring an end to the reign of terror created by the American Devil. But even as they searched, they couldn't help but wonder, was Mercer simply moving somewhere else? Or was he preparing for one final devastating act? The audacity of the killer. If there's one thing that separated Vernon Ray Mercer from common criminals, it was his audacity. Most fugitives, with law enforcement breathing down their necks and the media amplifying their crimes, tend to go underground, disappearing into forgotten corners of the map, doing everything in their power to stay unseen. But Mercer wasn't like most fugitives. While the nation panicked and police chased their tails trying to pin him down, Mercer didn't simply continue his spree. He took it a step further. His actions were bold, calculated moves of defiance. In a world captivated by his savagery, Mercer seemed determined to cement his myth, taunting investigators, taunting victims, taunting anyone who thought they could stop him. To Mercer, this wasn't just about killing. It was about control, domination, and showing the world that not even the most coordinated efforts could keep him in check. Returning to the scene of the crime. The most audacious act came just weeks after his chilling murders in Texas, when Mercer made a move that defied every expectation. He returned to the scene of his original crime in Brooklyn. It was a decision that shocked both law enforcement and the public, a brash act that signaled to the world that Vernon Mercer did not fear capture. Late one March evening, under the cover of darkness, Mercer slipped back into the rundown apartment where he had brutally murdered Josh Peterson and Emily Drake, the crime that started it all. At the time, NYPD had kept the building under sporadic watch, but no one ever expected that the very man they were hunting would have the nerve to walk right back in. It wasn't until a patrolling officer noticed the faint flicker of candlelight glowing in the apartment window that anyone suspected something was wrong. Initially, the officer assumed it was squatters or locals breaking in to explore the infamous Brooklyn Blood Room, as the media had coined it. But reinforcements were quickly called when the truth became apparent: the killer had returned. By the time police stormed the building, Mercer was long gone, but he had left something behind: his eerie signature. On the wall where hours had been spent cleaning off the original bloody message, "Life owes me," Mercer had spray-painted a new taunt in blinding red: "You won't catch me." For Monroe, standing in the same spot where she had first met Mercer's chaos, the brazen message hit like a personal blow. "This wasn't just about defiance," she muttered, her jaw clenched. "He's sending us a message. Not only can he do what he wants, but he's rubbing it in our faces. He's not running scared, he's playing with us." This act of returning to his old crime scene wasn't random. In criminal psychology, experts argue that bold moves like these are often indicators of two things: extreme confidence and an unrelenting drive for attention. Mercer wanted to remind investigators, and the world, of what he was capable of. But more than that, he wanted them to know they were powerless against him. Taunting the nation, Mercer's audacity didn't stop with his return to Brooklyn. As the nationwide manhunt intensified, he seemed to savor every minute of his infamy, pulling stunts that terrorized communities and left the country paralyzed by fear. At crime scenes, he left slivers of his mind behind: blood-written notes, objects disturbingly placed, and even messages scrawled in notebooks he planted for detectives to find. One of the most striking incidents occurred during an investigation into a recently burglarized home in Huntsville, Alabama. While there were no bodies, clear signs of Mercer lingered in the air. On the bedroom wall, spelled out in the victim's stolen lipstick, were the words, "Still here." The sinister note, left in pure silence, horrified investigators. The implication was chilling. Mercer wasn't killing out of necessity, he was making appearances like a performer returning for encores. And he wasn't rushing his crimes. He wasn't hurried. He was orchestrating chaos on his own time, slipping in and out of homes, leaving breadcrumbs not for them to find him, but to remind them that they couldn't. "He's treating the country like his personal stage," said Agent Julian Harris at the time. "And everyone else, from his victims to law enforcement, are just unwilling actors in the nightmare he's directing." His open defiance of law enforcement. One of Mercer's favorite methods of taunting his pursuers was his near-invisible movements. He had a knack for blending into the very fabric of small-town America, despite being featured on the evening news and plastered across front pages. Unassuming, wiry, with no distinct features, he could vanish in plain sight. Witnesses would later recall minor, unsettling run-ins in truck stops, diners, or gas stations, encounters that only seemed significant in hindsight. "I think he was in my diner one morning," one waitress in Indiana claimed. "He didn't talk, just ordered black coffee, sat in the corner. I didn't think much of him, but you bet I remember those eyes. Quiet but sharp, like he was watching everyone and deciding something about them." Such encounters were common, but concrete sightings were rare. This invisible man strategy, as Monroe eventually coined it, only added to Mercer's legend. He mocked the rigidity of modern surveillance. No social media trails, no bank cards, no cell phone. Mercer lived off the grid like he had been preparing for this for years. And then, there was the deliberate taunting, such as his custom of breaking into homes without taking or killing anything. In some cases, he would rearrange furniture slightly or leave cryptic notes in bloodless rooms. One chilling example came when a homeowner in Wyoming found the phrase, "a little time left," scrawled across a family portrait. These actions made America's neighborhoods feel fragile, unsafe, and exposed. Mercer in the media spotlight. While Mercer thrived on evading capture, he also seemed to feed off the media storm surrounding him. Networks called him the American Devil, talk shows pondered his next moves, and countless amateur sleuths on social media dissected his murders for patterns. It was precisely the kind of attention that seemed to fuel him. He wasn't vocal like some killers, but he didn't need to be. The spray-painted walls, lipstick threats, and cryptic notes all spoke louder than words. Mercer let the media do the rest of the work, turning him into the monster that haunted countless headlines. "There's no way a guy like this isn't watching us watch him," Monroe said in one tense meeting. "He's the writer, director, and audience of his own nightmare." The audacity wasn't just in his actions, it was in his attitude. Mercer knew he was famous, and he acted like it. Returning to Brooklyn, leaving behind notes of defiance, and continuing to kill with chilling precision even as the nation's eyes were fixed on him, all of it was part of a larger statement. "You can't touch me." the embodiment of fear. Ultimately, Mercer's audacity became his primary weapon. More than his violence, more than his cunning ability to stay ahead of the law, it was his sheer boldness that shook the country to its core. He made the nation feel like nowhere was safe. He turned everyday lives into horror stories, pressing his invisible hand on the shoulders of families as they locked their doors at night. With every move, every taunt, and every crime, Vernon Mercer reminded the world that he wasn't just a killer. He was a storm, a walking, breathing vengeance against a world he held accountable for his pain. He thought he was untouchable, Monroe said years later, reflecting on the case. And for a long time he was. The ending, the net closes. For months, Vernon Ray Mercer had been a ghost. He was everywhere and nowhere at once. A predator lurking just ahead of law enforcement's reach, taunting them, defying capture with an almost supernatural ease. But every game has an ending, and Mercer's reign of terror was about to reach its violent, chilling conclusion. What began as a spree of seemingly disconnected murders in Brooklyn and Texas unraveled into a massive nationwide effort to bring the killer to justice. For every move Mercer made, every cryptic blood-written message he left behind, investigators grew more determined. The hunt had become personal, not just for the families of his victims, but for the task force that had chased his shadow through small towns, highways, and even the remotest corners of the American wilderness. They had promised themselves and the nation that Mercer wouldn't get away forever. And finally, in the haunting isolation of Montana's vast wilderness, Mercer's audacious run would come to an end. The breakthrough in Montana. The moment of breakthrough came not from advanced technology or psychological profiling, but sheer chance. A trucker passing through a remote stretch of the Montana highway noticed something unusual: a rusted sedan abandoned just off the side of the road, its front tire nearly blown out from the harsh terrain. The trucker wasn't one to overthink. It looked like an ordinary breakdown, but with Mercer's crimes dominating the headlines and his face seared into the country's collective consciousness, something about the timing didn't sit right. A call to local authorities brought sheriff's deputies out to inspect the vehicle. It seemed ordinary at first glance, an old beat-up car left in a hurry, but when they searched the interior, every gut instinct proved correct. Inside, they found a knife tucked under the driver's seat, a bloodied notebook containing unhinged ramblings, and trace items that might have belonged to Mercer's victims: a scarf, a dried-up flower, even a small child's hair ribbon. "This was his car," said one of the officers at the scene. "No question about it." And while the vehicle was abandoned, it gave investigators a critical lead. Vernon Ray Mercer was somewhere in the dense, unforgiving forests of western Montana. A frantic search in the wilderness. As news of the discovery reached the National Task Force, an urgent new hunt began. Mercer had made his bid for survival in one of the harshest and most remote areas in America, a gamble that spoke to both his audacity and growing sense of desperation. The Montana wilderness stretched for miles in every direction, a rugged landscape of towering trees, jagged peaks, and icy rivers. It was a terrain perfect for someone who wanted to disappear, but also one that could easily become a trap for the unprepared. Helicopters patrolled the skies, sweeping the forest below with floodlights and coordinated grid searches. Search dogs were brought in to pick up Mercer's trail, their handlers pushing them through sharp brambles and uneven terrain. Armed teams, made up of FBI agents, local rangers, and specialized tactical units, scoured every old hiking trail, abandoned cabin, or potential hiding spot. "This isn't just some manhunt," Agent Julian Harris told reporters as the operation unfolded. "We're moving into his chosen battlefield, and that makes him dangerous. But let's be very clear, he's not going to win." Days passed with no sign of Mercer. The dense wilderness worked as much against the task force as it did against the fugitive. Search crews braved freezing conditions and unpredictable weather, but the man always seemed to stay one step ahead. Tensions ran high. Every snap of a twig, every rustling bush could have been Mercer lying in wait, or nothing more than the natural noises of the forest. The final standoff. After nearly 5 days of relentless searching, the break finally came at dawn. A team of rangers stumbled upon fresh footprints in the mud along the bank of a shallow creek. The prints were small, consistent with Mercer's size, leading deeper into the forest where the trees grew thicker and visibility dropped to near zero. Quickly, the discovery was radioed in, and within hours, dozens of agents were closing in on the area. Mercer had been cornered in the crumbled remains of an old logging cabin, long forgotten by anyone except perhaps locals venturing through the wilderness. The small wooden structure sat at the base of a rocky slope that rose into the fog like an impenetrable wall. It was likely the only true shelter Mercer had found for miles, and now it would serve as the site of his ultimate reckoning. As the task force surrounded the cabin, the air grew thick with tension. No one dared move too quickly. Mercer had proven to be ruthless, and no one wanted to underestimate a man who'd gone to such lengths to evade capture. Negotiators called out to him through loudspeakers, urging him to surrender. "Vernon Mercer!" the voice echoed through the cold air. "We know you're in there. There's no way out of this. Come out with your hands up and no one has to get hurt." For hours there was no response. Just the eerie stillness of the forest, broken occasionally by the distant caw of a bird or the rustling of a breeze through the branches. The tension was unbearable. Some began to think Mercer had already slipped away or perhaps taken his own life in a final act of defiance. Then came the gunshot. One loud, defiant crack erupted from the cabin. The shot did not strike any of the officers, but it was enough to send everyone into high alert. SWAT teams moved into position, waiting for orders to storm the building. Negotiators tried again to communicate, offering Mercer a final chance to come out alive. Mercer's final choice. What happened next was as chilling as it was inevitable. As the tactical teams breached the cabin door, they found Mercer sitting stiffly in a decrepit wooden chair at the center of the room. He wasn't armed. His hands rested limply on his lap. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow but piercing, like he'd already accepted his fate long before they arrived. He didn't fight, he didn't yell. He simply whispered 3 words, words that would haunt the investigators for years to come. "It ends here." Mercer rose to his feet, but before he could make another move, SWAT rushed forward, pinning him to the floor in seconds. The killer who'd left a trail of fear across the country, the man who had taunted police, manipulated communities, and killed without hesitation, was finally in custody. Justice and haunting questions. News of Mercer's capture spread like wildfire. Victims' families and survivors across the nation breathed a collective sigh of relief, but any sense of closure remained complicated. Mercer offered little in the way of explanation during his interrogations, avoiding questions about his motives and showing little remorse for his crimes. "It wasn't about them," he muttered cryptically during one session, leaving investigators to piece together the fractured motives he'd outlined in his blood-written messages. "I wanted them to see," he said, eyes cast to the floor. "I wanted everyone to see what they ignored." For Abigail Monroe, who'd been tracking Mercer since his crimes in Brooklyn, the arrest was bittersweet. "We got him," she told reporters weeks after his capture. "But the damage he did, that's not something anyone can make go away. He took lives, he shattered families, and he made the entire country live in fear. Some wounds don't heal no matter how much justice we deliver." Legacy of the chase. Vernon Mercer was sentenced to multiple life terms in federal prison without the possibility of parole. But his story didn't end with his incarceration. Books, documentaries, and countless analysis would dissect his spree for years, seeking to understand how one man could cause so much destruction and elude capture for so long. His cryptic writings, his messages scrawled in blood, and his chilling ability to vanish into the shadows would haunt the American consciousness for generations. Lessons learned after the killing spree. The terror unleashed by Vernon Ray Mercer left a stain not only on the lives of his victims but on the fabric of American society. His crimes shocked the nation and exposed vulnerabilities far beyond the crime scenes he painted with blood. After the manhunt and his subsequent capture, questions lingered, not just around how he managed to carry out his horrifying acts, but around the societal failures that allowed someone like Mercer to stew in isolation and rage until his world erupted into violence. For law enforcement officials, mental health advocates, and ordinary people following Mercer's story, there were hard lessons embedded in his grim legacy. Beneath the headlines, the documentaries, and the endless public discourse was an unsettling truth. Monsters like Mercer aren't born in a vacuum. They are shaped by neglect, by trauma, and by cracks in the systems that are supposed to protect both individuals and communities. 1. The need for better mental health infrastructure. Perhaps the most glaring issue underscored by Mercer's case was the inadequacy of mental health support in rural and marginalized areas. Born into poverty and dysfunction, Vernon Mercer grew up in an environment that normalized violence, isolation, and hopelessness. He avoided schools, workplaces, and relationships not because of choice, but because he lacked the tools and the support necessary to navigate them. People often wonder, why didn't someone stop him before he started killing? Said Dr. Marion Kane, the forensic psychologist who profiled Mercer. What they don't see is that people like Mercer don't just wake up one morning and decide to kill. There are warning signs, in his case, years of warning signs. But in America, particularly in rural, impoverished communities, no one notices them, or worse, no one has the resources to address them. Mercer's early life was riddled with red flags: violence at home, social detachment, deepening anger, and eventually a complete withdrawal from society. But the lack of affordable, accessible mental health care meant no one stepped in. No therapist, no counselor, no interventionist. The result? Mercer's pain and anger festered unchecked, transforming into the chilling violence that would later rock the nation. Advocates have since pointed to Mercer's case as a call for reform. Expanding mental health programs, providing free access to counseling, and offering outreach services to isolated or disadvantaged communities are no longer optional. They're essential to preventing future tragedies. His victims didn't just pay the price for his rage, Dr. Kane said. They paid the price for a system that failed to care for him before it was too late. 2. The role of community in isolation and alienation. Mercer's ability to blend into society while harboring such raging hatred exposed another unsettling truth. Humans can be invisible even when they're standing in plain sight. He wore the mask of ordinariness, a wiry frame, unassuming demeanor, and a quiet, wandering presence, so convincing that no one ever thought twice about him. This wasn't just a quirk of Mercer's survival skills, it was a symptom of the growing alienation present in modern communities. Even before he killed, Vernon Mercer was a ghost, said Detective Abigail Monroe. You talk to his former classmates, his co-workers, his neighbors, and all you hear is the same story. I barely noticed him. He wasn't memorable. In a world so connected and yet so detached, people like Mercer can slip through the cracks without a single person reaching out. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many Vernons are out there right now, simmering in silence, unnoticed by the communities around them? His case calls for a deeper understanding of what it means to truly live in a community, where connections aren't just surface level but meaningful enough to notice when someone is spiraling into darkness. Since Mercer's arrest, grassroots campaigns emphasizing the importance of human connection have sprung up across the country. Community groups have hosted forums on loneliness, promoted neighborhood events to build trust, and worked to raise awareness about how a kind word or a simple outreach might prevent someone from feeling invisible. 3. Rethinking security in vulnerable areas. Another hard lesson from Mercer's crime spree revolves around physical security, not just in urban centers like Brooklyn, but in rural and suburban communities across America. Mercer exploited the vulnerabilities of everyday neighborhoods, outdated security measures, blind spots in surveillance, and the naive belief that it could never happen here. In Texas, where Mercer brutally murdered the Carters in their modest farmhouse, the lack of reliable security cameras and alarm systems made him nearly impossible to track. In Brooklyn, the battered apartment complex where he killed Josh Peterson and Emily Drake had a security camera that hadn't worked in years. These failures offered little for investigators to work with, allowing Mercer to slip away unscathed each time. In both urban and rural settings, security is often an afterthought until tragedy strikes, said FBI agent Julian Harris. Americans have to start prioritizing preventative action, upgrading cameras, installing motion detectors, and building common-sense systems to reduce risks. It's no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. In the aftermath of Mercer's killing spree, demand for home security skyrocketed. Small towns that once scoffed at the idea of locking their doors began investing in advanced surveillance systems. Apartment landlords faced mounting pressure to upgrade outdated safety measures, and perhaps most importantly, community watch programs became more robust and alert, ensuring a collective effort to keep neighborhoods safe. 4. Media's role. Balancing awareness with sensationalism. The media played a significant role in the Mercer case, but not always for the better. As news networks scrambled to cover the gruesome killings and the nationwide manhunt, some critics argued that the incessant attention fed Mercer's ego in dangerous ways. Mercer's spray-painted taunts, "You won't catch me," and "Still here," revealed a man who thrived on notoriety. Every breaking news alert, every panel discussion analyzing his motives, every headline calling him the American Devil seemed to embolden him further. The media turned his monstrous acts into a spectacle, creating a mythos around him that only heightened the country's fear. It's a delicate balancing act, said investigative journalist Laura Trent, who covered the case extensively. Yes, the public has the right to know, but by making Mercer the center of a media storm, we risked turning him into a dark celebrity. It's something we, as a society, need to think harder about. Since Mercer's capture, initiatives have emerged to strike a more careful tone in how crimes are reported. Media outlets have worked with criminologists to shift the narrative away from glorifying killers and toward highlighting the stories of their victims. The hope is to deny future perpetrators the notoriety they might crave. 5. Supporting survivors and victims' families. For the families of Mercer's victims, the capture of their loved one's killer was bittersweet. While there was comfort in knowing that Mercer would face justice, no conviction could undo the damage he inflicted. Survivors spoke openly in the aftermath about the importance of long-term emotional support, something Mercer's case highlighted as a societal necessity. "No one sees what happens after the headlines fade," said Suzanne Peterson, mother of Josh Peterson. "People say, at least they caught him, at least he's behind bars." And maybe that's true, but it doesn't bring my son back. It doesn't heal the hole in my heart. We need more than just justice. We need care, for families like mine who are left picking up the pieces. Mercer's case has since amplified discussions about mental health care for victims' families. Counseling programs, financial assistance for those impacted by crime, and support groups have seen increased funding and attention. The emphasis is no longer just on catching the perpetrators, it's also on helping victims find their way back to the light. Conclusion: a nation on guard. The lessons from Vernon Mercer's deadly rampage don't end with increased security systems or better mental health access. They extend to the deeper, more human challenge of preventing another Mercer from festering in the shadows. His story highlights the need for vigilance, not in the sense of paranoia, but in fostering communities where no one feels invisible, no one falls through the cracks, and no one spirals into hatred unchecked. Monsters like Mercer are shaped, not born. If his reign of terror taught America anything, it's this: we can't afford to ignore the invisible pain of others, because when we do, that pain might one day burn the world down.